When you think of the American West, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Maybe it's a lone cowboy on a horse or a family in a covered wagon heading out to find a new life. Well, that whole image, the American frontier, isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a really powerful story America tells about itself. But like any good story, there's always more than one side to it. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today.
So, the story we usually get is pretty romantic, right? It's framed as this heroic journey of discovery. You've got brave pioneers heading into what's described as an empty, promised land, a wilderness just waiting to be civilized. It's a story all about progress, freedom, and, well, destiny. But what happens if we flip that coin over? If we look a little closer, a much darker story starts to take shape. Was it really a journey of discovery, or is it actually a history of conquest? A story filled with violent conflict, of people being displaced, and of erasing the cultures that already called that supposedly empty land home. It's this tension, this clash between the myth and the reality that we're going to unpack.
Okay, now for your baccalaureate, it's absolutely crucial we connect this to our Anglais Monde contemporain framework. So we're working within theme 3, relations au monde, and more specifically axis 3, regards sur le monde. We're looking at how we discover the world and how English-speaking societies think about travel and that encounter with the other, which is basically any group seen as different from the main culture. And let me tell you, the American West is a perfect, and I mean perfect, case study for this.
So that all leads us to our big guiding question for today. How did the myth of the American West shape a nation's identity? And maybe more importantly, what reality did that myth hide? To get to the bottom of this, we're first going to look at how this powerful myth was built, and then we're going to take it apart piece by piece with the historical reality. All right, let's dive into part 1, the myth. You see, this whole westward movement wasn't just a bunch of people deciding to pack up and go. No, it was fueled by a really powerful and very carefully built ideology. An ideology that said expanding the country wasn't just an option, it was a divine mission.
And right at the heart of this ideology is a super important concept you need to know: manifest destiny. The idea was pretty simple, but wow, was it effective. It was the belief that the United States was destined by God. It was their divine right to expand and spread its version of democracy and capitalism all the way across North America. It basically turned conquest into a moral and religious duty. The term itself was coined back in 1845 by a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan. Just look at the words he's using here. Providence has given us the great experiment of liberty. This isn't just politics. This language is designed to make taking over land sound like you're doing God's work, fulfilling a holy plan for America. It's incredibly persuasive stuff.
And this idea wasn't just in newspapers, it was everywhere, especially in art. Take this famous mural by Emanuel Leutze, Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. It literally shows the pioneers like they're the new Israelites about to enter the promised land. So this isn't just a pretty picture, it's propaganda. It turns regular settlers into these heroic, biblical figures on a sacred mission. Literature also played a huge part, and this is a great chance to use our PEE method. Point, example, explanation. So the point is that books and stories made the expansion seem really romantic. For our example, we've got this quote from Robert Louis Stevenson, who calls the whole thing an epical turmoil. And the explanation? Well, by using a word like epical, he's making a business deal. What he himself calls a quest for nothing more than a fortune sound like some grand heroic saga for the ages. Okay, so that's the myth. Powerful, persuasive, and painted in glorious color. Now, for part 2, the reality. Let's start peeling back those layers of the story and see what was really going on, what this big myth was hiding. And the contrast is, well, it's pretty stark. The myth gives you this image of a totally empty land, being settled peacefully by heroic white guys on a mission from God. The reality? It was a territory that was fiercely contested, filled with all kinds of different people, driven by really complex economic goals, and, more often than not, shaped by incredibly violent conflict. An empty land? No way. The West was a battleground. The expansion kicked off a whole war with Mexico. It led to decades of brutal conflicts known as the Indian Wars against Native American nations. There were even violent range wars between different groups of American settlers fighting each other over land and water. The very fact that there were treaties, like the Treaty of Fort Laramie, proves the land was already occupied. It shows that settlement was a process of force, negotiation, and a lot of broken promises,
not some peaceful walk in the park.
The myth also completely erases the incredible diversity of the people who actually built the West. It wasn't just white pioneers. You had African-American buffalo soldiers serving in the U.S. Army and the exodusters who were fleeing the South after the Civil War. You had thousands upon thousands of Chinese and Irish laborers who did the back-breaking work of building the Transcontinental Railroad. You had Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys, and entire Hispanic communities that had been there for generations. And women weren't just sitting in the wagon. They were landowners, farmers, and business owners in their own right. And another thing, while the myth was all about a divine mission, the reality was being pushed forward by some serious economic forces. The search for wealth from fur trading, people buying up huge chunks of land just to sell it for a profit. That's land speculation. And massive government payments to railroad companies. These were the real engines pulling the country west. It was just as much about profit as it was about providence. So, we've looked at the myth, we've looked at the reality. Let's wrap things up by talking about the legacy. How does all this still affect the American identity today?
Let's circle back to our big question one last time, just to bring everything together. How did this powerful story shape a nation, and what was the price of telling that story?
So, here's the bottom line. The myth of manifest destiny created this really strong national identity. An identity built on ideas of American exceptionalism, of nonstop progress, and of having a special destiny in the world. But, and this is a huge but, it only managed to do that by hiding a very difficult truth, that this progress was built on the violent conquest of other nations and by erasing the diverse, non-white people who were actually at the center of the whole story. Okay, before we finish, here's a quick, super useful tip for your exam. Remember that PE method we used earlier? Point, example, explanation? This is exactly how you should build your paragraphs in an analysis. Start with your main argument, your point. Back it up with a specific quote or fact, your example, and then explain how that example proves your point. It's a simple formula, but it is so powerful for making your analysis strong and clear. So why are we still talking about this 19th century story? Why does it matter to you, right now? Well, because figuring out how nations build these big founding myths is key to understanding our world today. It teaches us to think critically about the official stories we're told. It forces us to ask, who gets to be the hero in this story? Who gets left out, and why? It's all about representation, power, and otherness, core concepts for our course. And that brings me to a final question for you to think about. How do our modern stories of travel and exploration, everything from volontourism trips to developing countries to the dream of colonizing Mars, how do they maybe echo these old ideas of the frontier? Are we creating new myths today that shape how we see new frontiers and the other? That's a big question to chew on as we continue to explore our world and beyond. Thanks for joining this Explain.